Welcome. The weight of the day rests on your shoulders. Your thoughts begin to slow. Now it's time to unwind and let your mind rest in the calm of the past. Tonight we'll take a journey through history, one that gently leads you into sleep. Take a deep breath, close your eyes, and let yourself drift into a timeless story. This is History for Sleep. The son of the fjord. The gods of the north had created the world from ice and fire, and the coasts of Norway were the purest and most savage evidence of that creation. Here, where the sea pierced the heart of the land like a dagger, a fjord stretched under the shadows of massive mountains. In winter, its waters dulled like a leaden mirror. In summer, they turned into a cold emerald, reflecting the green of the sky and forest. On the shore of this fjord lay a small settlement, the home of Bjorn, who had seen 20 winters. Bjorn's world was composed of the scent of pine resin, the howl of the salty wind, and the solid thud each time an axe struck fresh oak. He was a shipbuilder, a skipper. It was a craft passed down from his father, and his father before him. In his hands, timber came to life, transforming into longships, vessels that would defy the wrath of the sea and dance upon the waves like dragons. His father, Eric, used to say, "A ship is not merely wood, son. It's a living being. You give it a soul. Its keel is the spine, its sail the lungs, and the oars are its arms." Bjorn looked at the sea serpent, the last ship his father had ever built. Pulled ashore, it sat like a wolf resting after a hunt. The carved serpent, head on its prow, seemed to gaze longingly at the sea, listening for the call of the waves. His father had sailed away on that ship for his final journey and never returned. Had a storm claimed him, or a Saxon spear on foreign shores? No one knew. In the north, the sea both gave and took, and that was a truth never questioned. That morning, Bjorn was riveting the iron boss onto a new shield in his workshop. Each strike of the hammer echoed through the silence of the fjord. In his mind, he envisioned a wall of shields, warriors locked side by side, forming a single body against enemy spears and arrows. Even the thought of it made his blood stir. In these seemingly peaceful lands, every man was born a warrior. Peace was merely a tired breath between two wars. Suddenly, a horn sounded from the mouth of the fjord. It was the signal of an approaching foreign ship. Bjorn set down his hammer and rushed outside. The other villagers emerged from their homes and fields, hurrying toward the shore. The ship that arrived belonged to one of the great clans. It was a messenger from Jarlborg. As the ship slowly docked, the expression on the warrior's face made it clear this was no ordinary news. The messenger leaped from the ship and stood before the village elder and chieftain Goam. "Greetings, Goam. I bring word from Jarlborg," he said in a loud voice. "All northern clans are gathering. The sons of Ragnar have called for vengeance. The blood of great Ragnar, who perished in the snake pit, will not be left unavenged. Ivar Ub Halfdan, all are there. The greatest army history has ever seen is forming to reckon with the Christian kings of England. The great heathen army is on the march." These words struck like a spark in a dry forest. The eyes of the men in the square lit up. The weariness from weeks of fishing and woodcutting vanished, replaced by a thirst for blood, plunder, glory, silver, and, above all, the highest honor a Viking could dream of, to fight in the revenge of the legendary Ragnar. Among the crowd, Bjorn saw another young warrior, Kale, shouting with wild fervor. Kale's hair burned red like the blood he spilled, and his eyes always glimmered with madness. "Odin will grant us victory," he roared. "We'll take the Saxons' gold and their women. We'll burn their lands to the ground." Bjorn did not share Kale's outward excitement. Within him, a deeper, more complex storm brewed. Avenging his father, yes, it was an honorable mission. But his thoughts drifted to Ira, who lived in a small house at the other end of the fjord. Strong, wise, and steadfast as a shield. He had made her a promise. They would spend the winter together, and in the spring they would marry. Going on this expedition would mean breaking that promise. That evening, the clan council convened. The decision was all but made. Gorm looked upon the young warriors with aged eyes. "Ragnar's call is Odin's call. This fjord will send its best warriors on this campaign." That night, Bjorn went to see Ira. In the flickering light of the torch, he saw the worry on her face. "You're going, aren't you?" Ira's voice was barely a whisper. Bjorn nodded. "It's a matter of honor, Ira. For my father's soul and Ragnar's revenge. For silver, for our family's future. Ira touched the scar on Bjorn's face. I know, she said. I would rather be the widow of a hero than marry a coward. But promise me one thing, Bjorn Ironface. Don't become a slave to ambition in the mud of England. Fight, but don't forget what you're fighting for. Come back to this fjord. Bjorn took her hand. I will return, he said. I swear to you, I will return. A week later, the sea serpent was ready for departure. Its holds were stocked with dried meat and fish, and its deck was loaded with shields, spears, and 20 men ready for war. Bjorn stood at the stern, at the helm. The villagers gathered to send them off. Ira stood at the front, tall and proud. Not a single tear fell from her eyes. A Viking woman sent her man to war this way with pride and a silent prayer. Bjorn looked at his fjord one last time. At the grandeur of the mountains, the calm of the waters, the smoke rising from his home's chimney. All that silence was now behind him. Ahead lay only the roar of the sea, the clash of shields, and the bloody promise of battle. As the sea serpent passed through the mouth of the fjord and met the mighty waves of the open sea, Bjorn knew when he returned, he would no longer be the same man. The son of the fjord was now off to share the fate of the wolf. As the sea serpent left the sheltered waters of the fjord and sailed into the merciless embrace of the open sea, the world Bjorn knew was left behind. The wind now blew harsher, the waves roared angrier, saltwater droplets crystallized in his beard and hair, and the biting cold of the north seeped through his armor into his bones. Days chased nights. The sun peeked faintly through gray clouds, while the moon at night carved a trembling silver path across the waves. The crew had found their rhythm amidst this endless blue. Some rowed, some mended the sails, others sharpened their blades for the battles ahead. At night, they gathered around a small fire at the center of the ship. That was when Finn, the oldest among them with a beard reaching his chest, would take the lead. More a skald than a warrior, his voice would mingle with the sea's murmur, bringing to life tales of old gods, giants, and heroes. He spoke of Odin's wisdom, Thor's strength, and Loki's trickery. These stories did more than inspire, they reminded the men of who they were and the blood that flowed in their veins. After a 10-day journey, the first shapes appeared on the horizon, not land, but a forest of masts spread across the sea. At an inlet on Denmark's coast, the greatest Viking fleet history had ever seen had gathered. Bjorn stood at the helm, awestruck by the sight. His sea serpent looked like a flickering candle among this massive fleet. Colossal warships, elegant carvey, nimble snecky, each with a prow carved into a dragon. A wolf, or a serpent head, glared forward. The air was filled with the murmur of thousands of men, the clanging of hammers, and roars of warriors. When the sea serpent anchored among the others, Bjorn and his men became part of this floating city. It was where all the rage and ambition of the north had converged. Blonde giants from Sweden, axe-wielding warriors from Denmark, clans from every fjord in Norway, they had come for one reason: vengeance and conquest. Bjorn searched for the tent of Ragnar's sons. It wasn't hard to find. At the center of the fleet, 3 massive ships bore a crimson raven banner. Around a fire in front of these ships stood the leaders, clad in the most splendid armor and weapons. Bjorn pushed through the crowd and saw them. Halfdan, tall and powerful like his father Ragnar, clutched a massive axe as if ready for battle at any moment. Upcomer, but with piercing eyes, exuded a dangerous silence. But Bjorn's gaze locked on the third brother seated on a throne-like chair. This was Ivar. It was said his legs could not carry him, and he was transported on a shield by his servants. Yet this physical weakness did not diminish the aura of danger and authority he radiated. Ivar the Boneless had gathered in his mind the strength missing in his body. His pale eyes, cold and unblinking like a serpent's, gleamed with an intellect that weighed every detail. He spoke little, only listened and observed. But everyone knew the brain of this vast army lay within that motionless body. As Bjorn looked at him, a chill ran down his spine. Fighting for this man was an honor. Opposing him was certain death. At that moment, a firm hand landed on Bjorn's shoulder. So the wind has blown the fjord's rat here too, Ironface. Turning around, Bjorn came face to face with Kale Blood Hair. Surrounded by his clan's warriors, Kale bore his usual mocking smile. Where I'm a rat, "You're nothing but a jackal, Kale," Bjorn replied calmly. "You're only here because you smelled the scent of carrion." Kale's grin vanished. "At least my father didn't become fish food. He died like a king, in a shield wall." The words struck Bjorn like a poisoned arrow. His hand instinctively moved to the hilt of his sword. The warriors around them stepped back, forming a circle in anticipation of a duel. But then, a sharp voice rang from Ivar's tent. "If you have the strength to fight, save it for the Saxons. Spill your brother's blood, and I'll feed your own to the ravens." The voice belonged to one of Ivar's most trusted commanders. Kale stepped back, breathing hard, and shot a venomous look at Bjorn. "We'll settle this later, Ironface. Let's see how long you last in England's mud." Bjorn took a deep breath. Even in this immense army, personal rivalries and ambitions still slithered like vipers. At that moment, he realized the war ahead wasn't just against the Saxons. They would also be fighting the desires and envy within their own ranks. That evening, massive bonfires lit up the camp. Barrels of ale and mead were opened. Warriors drank as if they would die tomorrow, sang and showed off their strength. Bjorn sat a little away from the chaos with his crew. Finn was once again telling a tale this time, an old saga of betrayal and fraternal strife. As Bjorn listened, his eyes stayed fixed on Kale and his group. A few days later, Ivar's war horn echoed across the camp. The leaders had gathered in the great tent. Though Bjorn, as the head of a small clan, wasn't invited, the news quickly spread through the army. The route was set, East Anglia. Rumor had it the king there was weak, making it an ideal place to winter and gather horses. From there, they would march north to the kingdom of Northumbria, where their father Ragnar had died. Finally, the great day came. At dawn, hundreds of horns sounded at once. Thousands of men rushed to their ships. Oars struck the water, giant sails filled with wind. Standing at the helm of the Sea Serpent, Bjorn gazed at the scene. Hundreds of dragon-headed ships moved as one, gliding into the sea. This wasn't a fleet, it was an invasion. It was as if the sea itself was rising against the land. Bjorn and the crew of the Sea Serpent were now a small but sharp cog in a vast war machine, and that machine was turning toward the green shores of England. The North Sea loved to betray Vikings. On the fourth day, the sky turned a sickly, purple-gray hue. The wind began to howl like a beast, and the waves rose into monstrous hills that threatened to swallow the ships. The Sea Serpent tossed like a leaf amidst the chaos. Every crashing wave threatened to flood the deck, and the mast creaked dangerously under the force of the storm. This was Bjorn's first true trial. At the helm, squinting against the wind and the crashing waves, he tried to remember everything his father had taught him. "Don't fight the waves, son," his father once said. "Dance with them. Let the ship use their strength." Bjorn shouted orders above the roar. The rowers fought to balance the ship, while others tried to lower the sail. At any moment, a single massive wave could overturn them or snap the mast in two. To their side, another ship briefly crested a wave before disappearing with a chorus of screams. The sea had taken it. Bjorn saw the fear on his men's faces, but he didn't show his own. The scar on his face gave him a grim expression. In the storm, it reminded them he was their leader. His calm was their only hope. The storm raged for a day and a night. When dawn finally broke, the wind had calmed and the sea grew still. Exhausted and battered, the crew saw a faint green line on the horizon. They took it as a gift from the gods. It was England. After the steep, unforgiving coasts of Norway, it looked like a promised land, rolling hills, lush meadows, and gentle rivers. These lands seemed soft, vulnerable. Though the great heathen army had lost a few ships in the storm, it struck the coast of East Anglia with immense power. As Bjorn pulled his ship onto the shore, he inhaled the scent of this new land. It smelled different, not of pine and salt, but of wet soil, grass, and flowers. But this peaceful fragrance would soon be replaced by smoke and blood. Ivar's strategy was simple: shock and awe. The army split into several columns, flooding inland like a tidal wave. Their first targets were the wealthiest and least defended places. Bjorn and his crew, alongside Kale's unit, advanced inland toward a monastery perched on a hill, St. Cuthbert's Abbey. As they moved silently through the woods, they heard a bell in the distance, a sound used by the Christians to call upon their god. Kale grinned at Bjorn and whispered, their god won't help them. The monastery was surrounded by a low stone wall more to keep animals out than attackers. The Vikings scaled it easily and rushed into the courtyard. The robed men inside, monks said, never seen such terror. Long-haired, bearded giants with axes and swords looked like nightmares made flesh. Bjorn had never seen anything like it. These men weren't warriors. They held no swords, no shields, only fear. Kale and his men charged without hesitation. Screams mixed with the sound of axes splitting wood and bone. Bjorn ran into the main church. The air was thick with incense. Stained glass windows cast colored light across the stone floor, creating an otherworldly atmosphere. But Bjorn's eyes were drawn to the golden crosses, silver candelabras, and gem-studded books. It was unbelievable wealth. His men shouted Odin's gift as they filled sacks. One tore the pages from a jeweled Bible, taking only its golden cover. Another shattered a stained glass image of a saint without a second thought. This was more than plunder, it was the destruction of a culture, a faith. Then Bjorn found himself face to face with a young monk, not even in his 20s, clean-faced, holding a heavy iron candlestick in trembling hands. His eyes were full of raw terror. Bjorn hesitated for a moment. This boy was not a threat, but Kale shouted from behind, "Why do you stop, Iron Face? Are you scared of their god?" Time slowed. The boy screamed and swung the candlestick at Bjorn. Bjorn sidestepped instinctively and drew his sword. The movement was one he'd practiced hundreds of times, fluid, fast, deadly. The steel slid beneath the monk's collarbone. His eyes widened in shock. Blood spilled from his mouth as he collapsed silently. Bjorn pulled his blade free and stared at the body. It was his first kill, not an honorable combat behind a shield wall, but a terrified, defenseless boy. His stomach turned. When he stepped outside, the looting was over. The monastery burned behind them. The Vikings laughed and congratulated each other with sacks full of loot. But Bjorn could not share their joy. He stared at the blood on his hands. That night, the camp held another feast. They drank stolen wine, counted gold. Bjorn sat alone by the sea serpent, away from the fires. In his mind, he saw the young monk's terrified eyes again and again. Old Finn sat beside him and handed him a wooden cup. "A man's first blood is a stain on the soul," he said quietly. "It doesn't wash off." "He was just a child, Finn," Bjorn said, voice hoarse, unarmed. "The threads of fate are woven by the Norns, Bjorn," Finn replied. "His thread ended today, in your hand. Yours is still being spun. You must learn to live with that stain. Will it make you weaker or stronger? Now you know what it means to kill. That knowledge is what separates you from beasts like Kale. You question why you kill. That is the burden of a true chieftain." Finn's words didn't silence the storm inside Bjorn, but they gave him direction. Yes, he would live with the stain, but he would not let it define him. He would not become like Kale. He would fight. He would kill. He would raid, but he would never forget why he fought, or the promise he made to Ira back in the fjord. The first wave had been easy. The monasteries and villages showed no resistance against the great army. But Bjorn knew this was just the beginning. England's kings would not let their land be trampled so easily soon. They would face not frightened monks but hardened warriors behind shields and spears. The easy spoils of the green shores were over. Now, the true war was about to begin. The easy victories in East Anglia had enriched the Viking army, but they had also awakened a satiated beast. They were no longer ghosts haunting the coasts. They were a force plunging into the heart of the land, shaking the kingdoms in their path. Ivar's plan was working. By the time the army entered the lands of the Kingdom of Mercia, they were no longer met by frightened priests and armed farmers. Now, they faced organized forces commanded by Anglo-Saxon warlords, aldermen, and their fire. News came swiftly by mounted scouts. Mercia and Wessex had allied to halt the invasion. Thousands of warriors had gathered in a valley near the River Trent. The inevitable would soon happen. Two armies, two cultures, two beliefs would meet in open battle. On the morning of battle, the valley was cloaked in heavy fog. It was both a curse and a blessing, hiding the enemy's numbers, but also threatening ambush. Bjorn took his place with the Sea Serpent's crew within the vast Viking army, feeling the tension in the air like a taste on his tongue. Thousands of warriors were all around him, some sharpening their blades in silence, others laughing nervously, and some murmuring prayers to their gods. Bjorn looked at each of his men. Since leaving the fjord, they had all changed. Their faces were harder, their eyes colder. They were no longer fishermen or farmers, they were killers, just like him. When the war horns rang through the fog, tens of thousands moved as one. Bjorn stood at the front line. Beside him was Ulf, a warrior the size of a bear, who locked his shield to Bjorn's. On his other side, young Leif did the same. Row by row, warriors behind them pressed their shields to the backs of those in front. This was Skjaldborg, the shield wall, the greatest strength and sanctuary of the Vikings. Within it, every warrior was protected and a protector. One's life depended on the man beside him. Bjorn peered through the narrow slit between his shield and the one next to it. As the fog began to lift, he saw them hundreds of meters away, forming a line just like theirs. The first rays of sunlight gleamed off their round shields and pointed helmets. They were almost equal in number. They too had banners, horns, and war cries. Gajifu, Gajifu, they shouted God's grace. The Vikings replied louder, Odin, Odin, Thor. And then, the march began. Two massive walls advanced toward each other with a slow, deadly rhythm. Only the beat of war drums and the slosh of thousands of feet against muddy ground could be heard. As the distance closed, Bjorn's heart pounded inside his chest. This was not like that defenseless boy in the monastery. This was steel meeting steel, bone meeting bone, a hell made flesh. The first rain of arrows came, and Bjorn instinctively ducked behind his shield. He heard the thud of arrows lodging into the wood. A man beside him gave a choking gasp as an arrow pierced his throat and collapsed. Another instantly stepped forward to fill the gap. There could be no holes in the wall, and then the world exploded in a thunderous roar. The crash of shield against shield sounded like the sky had cracked open. Bjorn staggered from the force of the Saxon wall, slamming into them, but stayed upright thanks to the warriors beside him. From that moment on, everything dissolved into chaos. He saw the Saxon before him, hate in his eyes, yellow mustache bristling, a spear in hand. The spear struck Bjorn's shield with tremendous force. Bjorn knocked it aside and thrust his sword under the shield, driving it into the man's knee. The man screamed and fell, only to be replaced by another. Time and place ceased to matter. Bjorn's entire world narrowed to the edge of his shield. Left, right, push, thrust, defend, sweat, and blood mingled in the air. In his ears, only screams, war cries, and the shriek of metal. He no longer thought his body moved by instinct, trained from years of preparation. His scarred face, streaked with sweat and mud, had hardened like iron. He was Iron Face. In the heat of battle, a disturbance broke out on the flank. Kale blood hair, burning for glory and fame, had broken from the shield wall with 20 men, trying to drive a wedge through what he thought was a weak spot in the Saxon line. They aimed for a standard bearer. It was a mad charge but also foolish. The integrity of the shield wall had been broken. The Saxon commander saw the mistake instantly. Get in, he shouted, advance. Saxon warriors poured into the gap like a flood. The Viking line was in danger of being torn apart. If that flank collapsed, the whole army would be flanked and slaughtered. Bjorn saw the threat. Kale's recklessness would cost them all their lives. For a fleeting moment, he considered letting him die. But then he saw Leif beside him fall, run through by a Saxon who had slipped into the gap. This wasn't about personal vendettas. It was survival to me with me. Bjorn roared, his voice barely cutting through the din of battle. 10 men rallied to his call. Without leaving their line entirely, they pivoted like a hinge to plug the breach. A desperate counterattack. It was Bjorn's most savage moment. No longer defending, he was attacking. His sword rose and fell, each strike cutting down another foe. He was cleansing the hell Kale had caused. His men, inspired by him, fought with equal ferocity. At last, they sealed the breach. The Saxon advance faltered. Kale and the pitiful few who remained with him limped back to the main line, wounded and ashamed. This maneuver became the turning point of the battle. The Saxons had lost their best opportunity, and their morale broke. Ivar, recognizing the moment, ordered one final push from the center, with fresh troops. The Saxon line shattered like glass and their warriors fled in panic. Victory belonged to the Vikings, but its price was steep. When the battle ended, the valley was a slaughterhouse. Bodies and wounded lay everywhere. Ravens had already begun to gather for their feast. Bjorn could barely stand from exhaustion. His body was covered in cuts and bruises, but none fatal. He counted his men. Of the 20 who had left the fjord, only 12 remained. He approached Kale, who was sitting beneath a tree, trying to wrap a deep wound on his arm. Bjorn stood over him. He didn't need to say a word. The cold fury in his eyes said everything. Your hunger for glory, Bjorn said in a voice like ice, cost Leif and 8 others their lives. When the skalds sing of this victory, Kale, your name won't be among them. Only the names of the dead will be mourned. Kale couldn't raise his head from shame. That day, Bjorn Ironface proved he was more than a warrior. He was a leader, one who could stay calm under pressure, hold his men together, and carry them to victory. Even warriors from other clans spoke of how he had closed the breach in the shield wall, and looked at him with newfound respect. From afar, even Ivar on horseback glanced his way and gave the faintest nod. That subtle gesture was more valuable than any battle won. After the blood-soaked victory, the army did not rest. They continued deeper, marching toward the heart of England. But now, they knew every inch of this land would be paid for in blood. Bjorn was no longer the young shipwright who left the fjord. He was now a warlord forged in the hell of the shield wall. The bloody victory at the broken shield wall had injected the great heathen army with arrogance and a sense of immortality. The kingdom of Mercia writhed like a serpent with its back broken. The Vikings no longer behaved like a raiding horde. They now acted as the rightful rulers of these lands. To spend the winter, they chose Repton, a large Saxon town at the confluence of the Trent and Tame rivers, as their base. The town's grand monastery became Ivar's longhouse, its sacred halls now stained by the crude laughter of the northern gods. For Bjorn, this winter proved more grueling than war itself. The immediate violence and adrenaline of battle had been replaced by the slow, rotting moral dilemma of occupation. As he walked through Repton's muddy streets, he saw the fear and hatred in the eyes of the Saxons. To them, Bjorn and his men were demons invaders who had taken their land, their homes, their families. These looks reminded Bjorn of his own village. His own family in the Fjordland sent a knot of guilt twisting through his gut. Not even the mead shared around the fire or the sagas of glory recited by old Finn could soothe the unease growing inside him. His men, however, were content. They had food in abundance, warm shelter, and riches from conquest. Kale in particular had embraced this new order with enthusiasm. He seemed to be compensating for his failure on the battlefield with cruelty toward the defenseless. He gambled with silver looted from the Saxons, and drew his sword at the slightest disobedience. The tension between him and Bjorn was like a crack running through a frozen lake, silent, but deep enough to shatter at any moment. One evening, Bjorn sat once more on the deck of the Sea Serpent, staring up at a starless, clouded sky. Finn approached and broke the silence. You cannot tame a wolf, Bjorn, said the old skald. Even if you cage him in a pasture, his eyes will always search for the forest. We are wolves too. These walls, these houses, they constrict our souls. They corrupt them, Bjorn corrected him. There is honor in war. In a shield wall, you fight a man who raises his sword against you. But here there is no honor, only brutality. Then why are we here? Finn asked. Vengeance is taken. Ragnar's blood has been washed with that of hundreds of Saxons. Do you want wealth? Your sacks are full of silver. Land, the mud beneath your feet is yours now. Where does your ambition end, son of the fjord? It was a question Bjorn had avoided asking himself for months. He had no answer. He was simply a cog in a vast war machine. That machine was driven by Ivar's will in the coldest days of winter. The first blow to their arrogance fell. A raiding party of 30 warriors sent south in search of supplies never returned. At first, no one cared. Perhaps they had gotten lost or found a richer village to plunder. But a week later, one of their horses returned, riderless, stabbed through the ribs by a spear. Tied to its saddlebag was a blood-stained cloth. Inside were 30 tufts of Viking hair, each one cut from the scalp of a fallen warrior, and knotted together. It was a message. A chill of dread swept through the camp. This was not the work of a conventional army. This was the act of a ghost, a shadow, striking from the dark. This was the hand of King Alfred of Wessex. Ivar the Boneless was livid. He summoned his warlords into his longhouse. "That swamp rat," he hissed, his pale eyes glowing with danger, "dares not face us in open battle. He hunts us from the shadows like vermin. You will find him, and his den. Bring me that king." Kale was the first to volunteer. This was his chance to reclaim his lost honor. Ivar granted him a force of 100 men. Bjorn, uneasy, was also tasked with a mission. He and 50 warriors were to follow Kale's company from the south, and if needed, cut off their retreat. And so, in the heart of winter, 2 Viking units set out into the depths of Wessex to the vast and treacherous marshes of Somerset. It was unlike any land they knew. Dense forests gave way to watery labyrinths, shrouded in fog. At any moment, the ground beneath them could turn to sucking mud and swallow them whole. Thick reeds obscured their view, and every rustle hinted at an ambush. It felt like a land the gods had abandoned. Bjorn's men followed Kale's force from several miles behind, moving more cautiously. Bjorn frequently ordered them to stop, listen, read the earth and the wind. In these lands, battles were not won by brute strength, but by patience. On the 3rd day, the sound of distant shouts and steel reached them. When they arrived, the sight was horrifying. Kale's men had walked into a trap ambushed in a narrow pass. Saxon warriors had emerged from the marshes. Archers rained arrows from trees. Bodies were everywhere. Kale and a few survivors had taken refuge on a hill, fighting desperately. Bjorn did not hesitate. "Shield wall, form up," he roared. His men quickly assembled a defensive line. This was no wild charge, it was a disciplined rescue. The Saxons, seeing a prepared force, hesitated. Bjorn's warriors pushed forward steadily, creating a path of retreat and dragging the survivors back. That night, what remained of the 2 groups camped on a dry island in the marsh. Kale was broken. Fewer than 20 of his 100 men remained. He approached Bjorn, no longer wearing his arrogant mask. They were like ghosts," he stammered. "They were everywhere. It was like they rose from the mud." "They weren't ghosts, Kale," Bjorn replied, staring into the fire. "They are men defending their home, and we're not the hunters here. We're the prey. This is Alfred's war, and he plays by his own rules." That night, Bjorn made a decision. He could not return to Ivar with failure. He had to understand this king. Before dawn, he took his 2 most trusted warriors and slipped away from the camp. He ordered the others to remain, no matter what happened. He didn't set out to fight, he set out to observe. For hours, they crept through water and mud like snakes, silent and unseen. At last, deep in the marsh, they found a hidden island, camouflaged by trees. On it stood wooden huts and a church. This was Athelney, the final refuge of the Kingdom of Wessex. From behind a tree, Bjorn watched. What he saw astonished him. This was no military camp. Among the soldiers were women and children. It was the last stronghold of a people. And then he saw him. In the center, dressed plainly and without armor, stood a man helping build a defensive wall with his people. His face was weary but unwavering. He spoke with the priest, then gave instructions to a blacksmith. He was no jeweled king on a throne. He was a leader in the mud, suffering with his people, fighting with them. This was King Alfred. For the first time, Bjorn felt not hatred, but something closer to respect. This man was no coward, as Ivar claimed. On the contrary, he was perhaps the bravest man Bjorn had ever seen. Because even in the darkest hour, Alfred had not abandoned hope. Bjorn withdrew quietly. He now knew what he had to do. He would not return to tell Ivar how weak Alfred was, but how dangerous. This marsh king could not be crushed by brute force. He had to be understood, fought on his own terms. When Bjorn returned to Repton, he was no longer just a warrior or a chieftain. He was the only Viking who had looked into the soul of the enemy. That knowledge would either make him the army's most valuable commander or a traitor in the eyes of its prideful leaders. The return to Repton was met with silence. The kind that settled not from peace, but from tension tight as a drawn bowstring. The news of Kale's failure had already reached the camp. Ivar's rage was legendary, but this time, it took on a cold, quiet form. He had not spoken to Kale. He had not even looked at him. The punishment for failure was often not delivered in shouts, but in slow, deliberate humiliation. Bjorn, however, was summoned immediately. His journey into the marshes had caught Ivar's attention. He was led to the longhouse by torchlight. The hall was darker than usual, lit only by a few flickering flames. Ivar sat atop a wooden throne carved with raven motifs. His thin frame seemed to dissolve into the shadows. Beside him stood Ub, silent and unreadable. Ivar's voice was soft, too soft. "You saw the Rat King, didn't you?" Bjorn nodded. "Yes. Alfred is not hiding in fear. He leads in the mud, fights with his people, sleeps in the cold. He is no coward. He is iron-wrapped in humility." There was a pause. Then, a dangerous smile curved across Ivar's lips. "Good," he said. "We will burn that iron." Bjorn felt the shift instantly. Ivar was not looking for understanding. He wanted revenge. "In spring," Ivar continued, "we will return to Wessex with everything we have. No more raiding parties, no more patience. We will turn that swamp into a grave. I want fire, Bjorn. I want the wind to carry the smoke of Alfred's last breath to the gods." Bjorn hesitated. "If we rush in without understanding the land, are you questioning me?" Ivar's voice cracked like a whip, up-tensed. Bjorn lowered his gaze. "No, my lord. Only warning you. Alfred fights with his mind, not his sword." Ivar's eyes narrowed, but he waved his hand. "Go, prepare your men. Your warning is heard and will be remembered." As Bjorn left, he knew that Alfred had already won the first battle. He had planted doubt among the strongest of the Vikings. Spring came late that year, as if even the land itself was reluctant to see what was coming. But when it arrived, it came with the fury of the old gods. Thousands of Viking warriors marched south, burning everything in their path. Villages were torched, churches razed, fields salted. Bjorn led the vanguard, his sea serpent now pulled by oxen through the roads instead of water, its dragonhead becoming a symbol of dread for the Saxons. But inside, Bjorn felt a growing unease. There was no resistance. The path seemed too easy. Villages abandoned, fields already looted, roads eerily empty. It was Alfred's trap. By the time the Vikings reached the edge of the marshes again, their supply lines were stretched thin. The land had swallowed the food. The men were tired, restless. Some had begun to question Ivar's leadership in whispers around fires. Then came the fire. Not theirs, but Alfred's. At night, the marshes lit up. Fires erupted not in villages, but around Viking camps. Traps had been laid, oiled reeds, dried hay hidden beneath brush. Entire flanks burned before they could react. Panic spread. Men ran into the water, only to sink into bogs they didn't understand. Bjorn tried to regroup his unit, but the chaos was overwhelming. Then he heard a horn, not Viking. A Saxon charge. Out of the fog came Alfred's soldiers, few in number, but precise in formation. Their strike wasn't about victory, it was about message. "We are not broken." Bjorn fought like a storm, cutting down to attackers and shielding a wounded comrade. His men, seeing his resolve, rallied. A counter-assault pushed the Saxons back, but Alfred had already melted into the marshes again, untouchable. In the aftermath, Bjorn stood among smoldering remains of tents and equipment. Dozens were dead, the men were shaken. Kale approached, bloodied but grinning. "Cowards," he spat. "They run from real combat." Bjorn turned on him. "They make us fight on their terms, and we keep following Ivar into a pit." Kale's grin faded. "You speak dangerously, Ironface." "I speak what every man here knows, but is too afraid to say," Bjorn replied coldly. "Ivar's pride will bury us." That night, in the shadows beyond the fires, whispers began to spread that Bjorn Ironface might be the only one who could lead them out. Repton no longer felt like a fortress, felt like a tomb waiting to be sealed. The once proud warriors of the great heathen army moved like shadows through its muddy streets. The fires burned lower, the laughter was forced, and eyes constantly searched the dark horizon. The Saxons had begun to reclaim the land not with grand armies, but with strategy, terrain, and patience. The Northmen had underestimated Alfred, and now they paid for it with hunger and fear. But what poisoned the camp most was not the enemy outside it, was the division inside. Word of Bjorn's warning to Ivar had spread. Some called him cautious, others coward. But most called him what they truly needed: a leader who thought beyond rage. Kale, sensing his own authority waning, moved swiftly. He gathered a following among those who still longed for glory, for blood, for the simplicity of blind conquest. He told them Bjorn had grown soft, that he dreamt of going home rather than finishing what they had started, that he sympathized with the Saxons. Bjorn did not respond to these rumors, not with words. Instead, he trained his men harder, reinforced discipline, and worked to keep morale alive without lies. But he knew the storm was coming, not just from Alfred's side, but from within. It came sooner than expected. One cold morning, Kale stood in the training yard before dozens of warriors and called Bjorn out. "Bjorn, Ironface," he shouted, voice like gravel over stone. "You hide behind honor and fear. You speak of caution and mercy, while our enemies burn our camps. I say you've forgotten what it means to be Viking. I say you are no longer fit to lead warriors." Gasps rang out. Every eye turned to Bjorn, who was strapping his armor in silence. He stepped forward, sword in hand. "I do not lead to feed my ego," he said calmly. "I lead so my men return home. Can you say the same, Kale?" Kale bared his teeth. "I say let the gods decide, home gang here now. A duel to the death." Bjorn nodded once. "Let them decide." The circle was drawn. Shields were set into the ground. The old laws invoked. No one would interfere. 2 men entered. One would leave. Kale struck first, wild, brutal. His axe came in sweeping arcs, meant to overwhelm. Bjorn dodged, deflected, never wasting energy. He fought like the shield wall itself, steady, unbreakable. Their blades clashed like thunder. Bjorn's arm bled from a near miss. Kale's side bore a gash from Bjorn's sword. They circled, panting, feet slipping in the churned mud. It was not a glorious duel, it was raw, ugly survival. At last, Kale lunged, desperate. Bjorn stepped aside, grabbed Kale's wrist, and twisted. The axe flew from Kale's hand. In one fluid motion, Bjorn slammed his shield into Kale's face and brought his sword to the red-haired warrior's throat. The circle fell silent. Bjorn's blade hovered. Kale spat blood. "Do it. Finish it." Bjorn looked into the eyes of the man who had insulted him, betrayed him, and cost him the lives of his warriors. "And yet, no," he said, "you're not worth my soul." He turned away. Kale roared and lunged barehanded. Bjorn didn't hesitate this time. Steel flashed. Kale fell. That night, a new kind of silence fell over the camp, not of fear, but of acceptance. The men knew now, Bjorn was not just strong, he was just. Ivar summoned him again. "You've killed one of my commanders," the boneless chieftain said. "I defended my name," Bjorn replied, "and protected your army from his recklessness." Ivar studied him for a long time. Then he smiled thinly. "Lead the next assault on Alfred's defenses," he said. "Show me your way is better." Bjorn nodded, but inside, he knew this was no gift. This was a test. If he succeeded, he might reshape the campaign. If he failed, Ivar would bury him beneath it. As he left the longhouse, Ubi followed and placed a hand on Bjorn's shoulder. "Be careful," he said. "You're walking the edge of a blade." Bjorn simply replied, "So is everyone who carries a sword." The orders were clear. Lead a strike into the marshes, locate Alfred's stronghold, and destroy it. But Bjorn had no intention of repeating Ivar's mistakes. This would not be a show of rage. It would be a lesson in patience. He chose only 30 warriors, not the fiercest, but the most disciplined. Men who listened more than they shouted. Men who knew how to move through silence and shadow. Among them were Old Finn, the scarred scout Rurik, and Thora, a shield maiden with eyes as sharp as her blade. Before dawn, they departed Repton, heading south not by road, but through hidden paths, avoiding settlements and patrols. Bjorn's plan was simple: observe, learn, strike only when the enemy did not expect. On the 5th day they came across an abandoned chapel in the woods. There they found signs: fresh ashes, footprints, discarded tools. A hidden path began behind the altar, leading into the deeper marshes. "This is it," Rurik said. "They're close." Bjorn didn't rush. He ordered a silent camp, buried their fires, doubled the watches. He studied the terrain like a shipwright, studies the sea, reading every ripple, every whisper of the wind. He remembered Ira's words, "Don't forget why you fight." And then they found a Tuthelni again. But it had changed. Wooden walls now surrounded it. Watchtowers stood tall. Traps lined the water. Alfred had turned the island into a fortress. But inside, it was not only soldiers. They saw families, children, elderly, and yet, no one cowered. Every person worked, weaving rope, boiling pitch, fletching arrows. Bjorn watched from the reeds. "This is not just a kingdom," he said. "It's a people refusing to vanish." That night, the Vikings held council in silence. Bjorn spoke plainly. "If we strike now, we may wound them, but it won't destroy them. We must bleed their spirit." He divided his group. One team would sabotage supply routes, destroy carts, poison wells. Another would set fire to outer farms to lure soldiers out. A third, led by Bjorn himself, would breach the wall in the confusion and mark the weak points for a future assault. For days, the plan unfolded. The Saxons began to stretch thin. Their guards grew restless. But Alfred did not fall for the bait. He held his ground. Bjorn knew what must come next. Fear. They struck at night, silent as wolves. They infiltrated a watchtower, lit the hay stores aflame, then vanished into the fog. The fire could be seen for miles. The Saxons scrambled to defend the perimeter, but the attackers were already gone. It worked. Panic grew. Rumors spread that the Norse gods had returned to haunt the swamp. Some said they saw Ironface himself walking through fire without burning. But even as they celebrated small victories, Bjorn felt the cost. On the sixth night, Thora was slain, pierced by a hidden Saxon spear while covering their retreat. She died without a sound. Bjorn closed her eyes with his own hand. "She was the strongest among us," Finn said. "Even the Norns will weep." Bjorn stared at the marsh. "We bleed them, they bleed us. The difference is, they bleed together." On the 10th night, a horn sounded not from Alfred's camp, but from behind. Bjorn froze. Reinforcements had come, but not theirs. A new Saxon force, led by a young thane from Kent, had circled north. Bjorn's group was now caught between two enemies. "Back to the chapel," he ordered. "We hold there." They ran through water and flame, carrying wounded, dragging the dying. At the ruined chapel, they formed a shield wall in the nave. Torchlight danced on broken stone and stained glass. Outside, boots sloshed through the mud. "We're outnumbered," Rurik said. "We can't hold long." "We hold long enough," Bjorn answered, "for the wolves to return." And return they did. As the Saxons prepared their assault, a new horn sounded deep and guttural. From the woods, more Vikings emerged. Not just Bjorn's men, but others. Warriors from clans once divided. Men who had followed his reputation. Men who believed not in Ivar's fury but in Bjorn's resolve. The Saxons hesitated. That was all the Vikings needed. The clash was brutal. Swords rang in a chorus of fury. Bjorn fought like a storm, unleashed, his shield cracked, his blade red. He saw the young thane fall, impaled by Finn's spear. The Saxons broke. The chapel held. When dawn rose, Bjorn stood atop the hill, watching smoke rise over the marsh. The Saxons had retreated. For now, old Finn came to his side. "You did what Ivar couldn't." "No," Bjorn said. "I did what Kale wouldn't." He looked at the survivors, exhausted, wounded, but alive. "The wolves are back," Finn said. Bjorn nodded. "And this time, they hunt together." The war did not end in fire. It ended in silence. After the skirmish at the chapel, Alfred withdrew deeper into the marshes. Ivar's forces, worn thin and leaderless in spirit, failed to deliver a final blow. What began as a conquest had become a siege without victory. The great heathen army fractured. Some leaders returned to their homelands with silver and scars. Others stayed, carving out new kingdoms on Saxon land. Ivar vanished into the fog of histories. Some say he died from disease, others that he was taken by madness. But Bjorn Ironface made his choice. He gathered what was left of his men, stood before them one morning in the ruins of a Saxon fort, and said, "The gods gave us strength, the earth gave us pain, the sea calls us home." There were no objections. They left Repton behind, not as conquerors, nor as exiles, as survivors, wiser, changed. The journey north was long and bitter. Winter clung to the land like a ghost. On the road they passed the remnants of what they had once burned. Villages rebuilding, Saxon children playing in the mud, widows tending to graves, Bjorn said nothing, neither did his men. There were no words that could name what war had taken from both sides. When the first peaks of the fjords mountains rose into view, the men wept. Some fell to their knees, others whispered prayers. The sea opened before them like a forgotten memory. The sea serpent, once stained with blood and salt, slid back into the water as if it had never left. As the longship entered the fjord, the wind shifted and the scent of pine returned. Bjorn stood at the helm, hand on the carved serpent's head. His eyes scanned every familiar stone, every bend in the cliffs, and then, like a heartbeat from the past, he saw its smoke rising from a chimney. His home, the village, had not forgotten him. They arrived to cheers, tears, and silence. Mothers held sons they had feared lost. Children saw fathers changed by battle. The skalds would later say, "The wolves returned, and the forest held its breath." But Bjorn did not seek celebration. He walked alone, to the far end of the fjord where a small house stood, still and waiting. She was there. Ira stood by the door, arms crossed, chin high. She had not wept. She had not prayed. She had waited. Bjorn stopped a few paces away. No words came. None were needed. Ira stepped forward and pressed her hand to his chest. Her fingers brushed the old scar on his face. "You came back," she said. "I said I would," he answered. "And are you still the man I promised to marry?" Bjorn hesitated. "No," he said honestly. "That man never saw death. This one has eaten beside it." Ira nodded. "Then I will marry this one instead, if he still knows how to build ships." Bjorn smiled his first true smile in many seasons. In the seasons that followed, Bjorn rebuilt the shipyard, not for war, but for trade. He taught young boys to shape hulls, not hold axes. He told stories of a marsh king who fought with his mind, of shield maidens and lost friends, of fire and ice, of glory that tasted like ash. He never sought chieftainship, nor crown. But when trouble came to the fjord, when others threatened their peace, it was Bjorn they turned to, and he led them, not with fury, but with memory. For he had been to the end of the world. He had stood in fire, and returned home.